Hello, welcome to the second installment of our three-part series on Muslims in Brooklyn, using oral histories in the classroom. My name is Shirley Brannaleen, and I'm the manager of education at Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History. Today, I'm joined by my fellow colleagues from the Education Department at CBH, as well as our speakers, Dr. Habiba Noor, curriculum author and educator, and artist and curriculum writer, Allison Kaiser, who's also the former director of Challenge Islamophobia. Before we get started, Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History stands on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape, Delaware people. As a sign of respect, we like to recognize this with this land acknowledgement. Okay. Before we get started, let's get to know each other through a few polls. Number one, where are you joining us from? Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, elsewhere in the tri-state, elsewhere in the US, or abroad? Please feel free to answer the question. Okay, just waiting. Here we go. And it looks like we have 56% are from Brooklyn, 13% from the Bronx, 6% from Manhattan, 6% from Queens. We also have people from 13% from elsewhere in the United States, and 6% are from abroad. Thank you so much for joining us today. For our second question, which grade level do you teach? Elementary, middle, high school, museum, cultural institution, or other? Okay. Let's see, just a few more moments. And it looks like 25% of you are elementary school teachers, 13% middle, 25% high school teachers, 13% from museums or cultural institutions, and 25% from others. Wow. For our next question, which subjects do you teach? History, social studies, ELA, all of the above, visual performing arts, or others? Okay, it looks as if 20% of you teach social studies and history, 20% teaches ELA, 13% teach all of the above, and 40% of you teach other, while no one teaches visual performing arts. No problem. Okay. And have you used oral histories in the classroom before? Yes or no? Huh. 56% of you have used oral histories in the classroom, while 44% of you have not. Well, I'm so glad that you're joining us today, because you're going to really learn a little bit more about using about how to use oral histories, and especially how to use them in the classroom. Thank you for sharing. Our agenda for tonight is currently, of course, I'm Shirley Brannaleen. I'm doing the welcome and overview. Next, we will have our oral history and culturally relevant pedagogy with Dr. Habiba Noir. Then Challenge Islamophobia, project overview and activity with Allison Kaiser. And then we will have oral history listening activity, listening to two different oral histories, Becoming the Bully and Fear of Deportation. And then lastly, we'll have wrap-up surveys and CTLE. Our objectives today. K through 12 educators will take away lesson ideas for incorporating culturally relevant perspectives into curriculum, as well as other resources to engage students with Muslims in Brooklyn and other oral histories. Okay. We have a wonderful website that's actually in the booklet that I have put into the chat, that please feel free to join, to actually visit that website in order to hear the oral histories and be able to see the lessons. CTLE credit. At the end of today's workshop, we'll share a survey link for you to share your feedback on today's event. Filling out this survey is also your ticket to receiving CTLE credit if you would like. Virtual housekeeping. Please feel free to add your name and pronouns here so that everyone can see on the screen. If you go to participant and you find your name, you can be able to right click and be able to press rename, and then you can be able to put in your name and then parentheses, he/him, she/her, they/them, whichever pronouns best work for you. Virtual housekeeping, please use the chat feature in order to ask your questions during the presentations. We will get to the questions usually as soon as the speaker has finished speaking, as well as this particular session, as well as all of our sessions. We do offer closed captions. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to find the closed caption button. If you have any other questions, please email us. This session is being recorded and will be utilized on our YouTube channel. When you signed up, you did agree to being part of this recording. However, if you choose not to, then please turn off your camera and please refrain from verbalizing your questions. Please use only the chat feature. Our events are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators that is inclusive of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. All attendees are expected to show respect to presenters, organizers, and other attendees. Muslims in Brooklyn is a project originally started by Brooklyn Historical Society, but is now part of the Center for Brooklyn's History. And this particular website, actually this particular project does look at the diverse Muslims that are here in Brooklyn. It does contain lots of oral histories, but it also contains lots of lessons, which we will be looking into one today. Now, I would like to present our presenters. First is Dr. Habiba Noir, who is an author of the Muslims in Brooklyn curriculum. Currently, Dr. Habiba Noir is an interdisciplinary scholar who lies at the intersection of media studies, religious studies, and education. She received her PhD in media and cultural studies from the Institute of Education in London. Her dissertation focused on Muslim youth and their relationship to news of the quote-unquote war on terror. She used an arts-based research method, asking young Muslims from diverse ethnic class and sectarian backgrounds to make news clips on the war. Prior to this, she worked as a public middle school teacher in Oakland, California, as well as here in New York City. Also joining us today is Allison Kaiser, who is a multimedia artist whose work centers Muslims and Islamophobia. She is a resident artist at Red Dirt Studio in Mount Rainier, Maryland, where she's working on a series of artwork about the impacts of the 9/11 era on Muslims and other targeted communities. Previously, she was the director of the Challenge Islamophobia project at Teaching for Change, where she wrote a teaching guide on anti-Muslim bias and shared the lessons in teacher workshops throughout the country. She wrote curricula and facilitated workshops for the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, Zin Education Project, Amnesty International, Unity Production Films, Cutter Foundation International, and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. She holds a BA in Race, Class, and Gender Studies and an MA in History. So first, I'd like to say thank you to both of you for participating in this workshop today. It truly is our honor. And on this note, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Khabib Noir.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the introduction, Shirley, and the Brooklyn Public Library. So I was the author of the Muslims in Brooklyn curriculum, but let me just tell you a little bit about the project. The Muslims in Brooklyn the Muslims in Brooklyn Oral History Project was a project that that interviewed about 53 folks who identified as Muslim in Brooklyn, and it's you know, I saw that some of you have some experience with oral history, but I think it's important to start with this, with the idea that, you know, oral histories are often used by historians. They're often used by novelists, maybe journalists, and they're often sitting in archives and they become useful to scholars. What we did in this project was to try to sort of free that knowledge and make it available to average folks, and particularly into the K-12 environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little tour of the website and show you different aspects of it, and then to talk a little bit about the significance of using oral histories in the classroom. So I'm just going to share my screen for a minute to give you a little tour of the website. So this is the website that houses the oral histories. And what we have is we have some of a selection of the narrators, and when we're doing oral history, the interviewees are called narrators. So we have different narrators that, and each narrator that is identified on this site has a few different clips, and this is somebody who we'll be listening to later today. And so, you know, typically each of these oral histories is about, you know, between an hour to 2 hours long, and that's a bit much to have students listen to, and it's quite involved to engage in this work of oral history. But what we've done is we've shortened it to little clips. So it is not the oral history in its entirety, they're little clips. Another point I'd like to make is, so we have these clips that are available for you all to listen to on your own at some point, but we've also made lessons, and I will just show you that what we've done is we've created small collections of these oral history clips. And with each collection, we've created a lesson plan, which of course, like all lesson plans, you can read them and think about how they can be best adapted for your needs. But each of these lessons comes with a sort of curated collection of oral histories. So I want to also make the point that oral history is, when we think of doing oral histories in the classroom, the most common way is we ask students to conduct their own interviews and to go out into the world and interview folks, bring it in and share the interviews that they've done. It's less common for students to actually engage in the listening of other oral histories. So in some ways, this project is kind of, it offers a really new and fresh way to think about oral history. And two things that I want to point out before we actually go into our our lesson that we're going to do is that this collection of oral histories is not a lesson on Islam 101. So for those of you that have come here looking to kind of get some lessons on teaching Islam, you will not find it here. You will not find the sort of overview of the religion here. What you do find and what you will find is our stories from Muslims. And in fact, one way we can characterize this is thinking about this as the experiences of lived religion. And this notion of lived religion is important because, you know, we can think about religion as sort of a set of orthodox texts and practices, which is a way that we often teach religion, or some people teach religion. But you can also see religion as something that is embodied, practiced, lived, where there's multiple notions of how to live in their religious traditions. And I think that in listening to oral history, you're listening to the lived experience of religion. You're not necessarily focusing on orthodoxy. And I'm really happy that we have Allison with us today to dig into this issue, because the theme that we're really going to be addressing in today's lesson is this the theme of how to teach the topic of Islamophobia. And Allison Kaiser has done some amazing work on thinking about how to teach Islamophobia in the classroom, and she's written on this subject. And I just want to kind of pass the mic to Allison to talk a little bit about her framework for teaching around Islam and Islamophobia.
Okay, thank you so much, Habiba, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So yeah, to give you some background, you know, I have been an educator for over 20 years. I've done a lot of teaching about Muslims, Islam, and Islamophobia. And I started the Challenge Islamophobia project specifically because of, you know, all of the trouble I encountered trying to teach those subjects, and also just how my thoughts and pedagogy evolved over time. And so I'm going to share this article with you. This really started the project, an article I wrote for Rethinking Schools. The Challenge Islamophobia project is housed at Teaching for Change, which is a sister organization of Zen Education Project and Rethinking Schools. I'm sure many of you know them and love them. And if you don't, you should know them. Writing really impactful intersectional social justice curriculum. So I wrote this article, and really it was like my own experience was that I did, as Habiba just said, you know, when I started teaching against Islamophobia, I did run to the Islam 101 pedagogy, because that's really like all that I had access to. And it was after using that and realizing that it was really the wrong way to go if we want to talk about anti-Muslim bigotry. And so I'll just give you a very you know, quick synopsis of that argument. You have access to the article if you want to read it. But basically, you know, there's so many problems with the Islam 101 pedagogy. First of all, it always starts out with this like 5 pillars of Islam, this neat, clean, and easy bullet point list. And, you know, teaching in the US, I would always be in rooms where there's like a majority of Christians, and I would always ask them, like, could you please all, you know, come up with a 5 bullet point list of your beliefs, you know, that apply to Christians all over the world. And of course, they would start laughing and be like, that's ridiculous. But this is what you see in textbooks about Muslims and Islam, right? So it's this super simplistic framework. It's also, and many teachers don't know this, it's a completely sectarian framework. You know, that framework only represents certain Muslims. And, you know, so there's so many problems with that. And instead, when we think about anti-Muslim bias, you know, we should be approaching it as a form of racism, I think, that is part and parcel of, you know, the history of this country. So instead of trying to look elsewhere, you know, the idea of the Challenge Islamophobia project is let's start here in the history of this country and try and start unpacking this. So to give you to give you some idea about this project. And also, yeah, I want to introduce you to one lesson in this set of lesson plans. And the lesson that I'm going to introduce today is called What is Islamophobia? And I think this is a really great lesson plan. I've used this in many different settings, and it always works really well. It's super easy to modify, which we can talk more about later, depending on your audience. And I really love this lesson because I think that sometimes, we talk about these really heavy topics, racism, Islamophobia, and yet we never really take time to define what that word means. And yet we all have different definitions. And I've done this exercise in so many different audiences where I just walk in and say, what is racism? And there's such a great variety of answers, right? And it's all true. And yet, if we don't really define what it is we're fighting, we can't transform anything. So I really like this lesson in that it just kind of starts from the beginning. It puts all the power into the hands of the students. Basically, the lesson starts with, students thinking about like what comes to mind when they think about Islamophobia. And then throughout the entirety of the lesson, they keep getting introduced to new evidence. And then they go back to the definition. Well, now that you heard this story, what would you add to the definition of Islamophobia? And just keep scaffolding it, right? And I find that the lesson to be really potent in that respect. Overwhelmingly, the response I get from students is, I had no idea this was going on. I had no idea all of the different examples and how they all fit together. So yes, in the chat, the PDF was shared. The Challenge Islamophobia project, all of the curriculum is free and downloadable. I think you have to plug in your email address, but that's it. Okay, so let me just think here how we're starting this. Okay, so I think, why don't we just, I will give you time to like read through the lesson plan and ask questions in a little while, but I just want to walk you through some of the beginning exercises of this. So let's use the chat. If I was in a room, I would just have, whiteboard or piece of paper up on the wall and say, what do you think about when you think about Islamophobia? What words come to mind, phrases, you can just spit stuff out. Are we using the Jamboard for this, Habiba? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to share that with you. Okay, cool. So the link is in the chat if you click on the link. And please just add some sticky notes.
And if you haven't used Jamboard before, I'm wondering, I'm assuming many of you have, you can just grab a sticky note and put a definition of, to answer this question, what is Islamophobia? And then it will just land on somewhere on here.
When you say grab a sticky note, where do you grab it? Oh, you just take one.
Yeah, right here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just read some of them out loud as folks are putting this in. It's the fear and prejudice towards Muslims. That's one concept. Attacking mosques, stopping mosques from being built. Oh, wait, did something just happen? Did they just get deleted? Ooh. Okay.
Oh, weird. Okay, they said that can you repost the link? Someone's saying that it was knocked out of the.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I will repost the link. Oh, actually, Charlie, do you mind reposting the link? Resharing?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay. Fear and hatred. Hate towards the idea of religion. Rooted in colonialism. Not being aware. Fear and hatred towards Muslims.
And in the chat, someone also said mistreatment, fear, hatred, and prejudice towards Muslims. Good. Okay. So, I mean, this is how you start. Just get students, to start, just spitballing here, and then save this. So again, like in face-to-face classes, I would, put this on like a big piece of paper or on the whiteboard where it could be preserved throughout the lesson, because you want to keep coming back to this and keep adding more. So that students can see the complexity of trying to build, a definition that has integrity. So you do that piece, and then we start to build on evidence. So we start to share all different kinds of stuff. There are poems in this lesson. There are news clips, videos, all kinds of stuff. To start with, we're going to listen to two young people recite a poem that they wrote about their experiences with Islamophobia. So for right now, I'm going to share my screen. We will listen and watch them present their poem, and then we'll talk more after that. And hold on 1 second so I can fix my.
Because we Muslims
get it? Bomb squad. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace be upon you,
who goes home and kisses your mother on her cheek and tucks your little sister into bed.
who probably doesn't know that the woman whose face you spray painted
go home,
over is also a daughter,
a sister, a human, who refuses to believe that even though she was born and raised in this country, her modesty and ideology make her foreign, alien, dangerous,
a threat to freedom.
the very freedom you're stripping her of. May peace be upon you,
who plays Call of Duty to practice being a soldier, so the life of the enemy is laid upon the buttons of your controller.
because you don't want to see what happens to little Muhammad once he grows older, so you're practicing for the day you can finally get some closure.
And just because the Muslims threaten you, you give us all the cold shoulder, knocking us all out like we're the pins, and you're the bowler.
May peace be upon you,
Who takes your daughter's hand?
and crosses the street when you see a bearded man about to pass you.
A man who's just returned from the mosque, where he knelt to the ground and cried as he prayed for his father's health.
But in your eyes, he's probably a rapist, scum of the earth.
Evil to the point where just sharing the same sidewalk with him will taint your child's
Milky white innocence.
May
May peace be upon you,
who let the hijabi girl sit alone during lunchtime.
All she got was stares, like she's a suspect of some crime.
She was innocent, but they would always whine.
That the hijab on her head was an ISIS sign.
She was the butt of every joke, at the end of every punchline.
Yet you didn't talk to her once.
Couldn't save her, not one time.
May peace be upon you, who can spend hours on Tumblr ranting about how we shouldn't be in this country, but can't take 5 minutes to see from our point of view.
Can't even look up the difference between Arab and Muslim on Wikipedia.
You say you're fighting terrorists from behind your computer screen, but can't see that you're the one terrorizing me. May peace be upon you,
who stopped that innocent dad from seeing his child.
because of his beard, his name, and his clothing style.
He can't wear a kufi without you assuming that he's so vile he just hasn't seen his own daughter for a long while.
But when he tried to board an airplane, he was accused of being hostile because of you, who prejudge based on a profile. You know, when we were doing research for this poem, we Googled,
Why are Muslims so?
and here are the top 10 results.
Why are Muslims so crazy?
Those Aladdins,
Why are Muslims so violent?
those ninjas,
Why are Muslims so angry?
those towel heads,
So stupid.
those sand
so
monkeys,
shallow.
those rag
so
heads,
strict.
those sand kissers,
so barbaric.
those bin Ladens,
so fanatic.
you Arabs,
so intolerant.
you sand niggers,
extreme.
terrorists.
Oh, it's just so stupid because listen, those words mean nothing to me because they don't define me.
No graffiti artist is gonna tell me to go home.
No Call of Duty player is gonna threaten me.
No overprotective bigot of a mother is gonna ruin my day.
No ignorant bystander is gonna leave me feeling left out.
No Tumblr post is gonna scare me away.
And no biased border patrol is gonna stop me from seeing my family.
Because today is one of the holiest days of the year, and instead of spending time with my family,
I'm up on stage defending my family.
because when society makes plans,
They don't think about us.
I wonder if an international youth poetry slam in the cultural mecca of the South would be held during Christmas,
Easter, but it had to be on Eid.
and because it's Eid,
We're up here to say, may peace be upon you, B&V. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Eid Mubarak, everybody.
Okay, plenty of plenty to react to there. When I was working on this project, I was just remembering that I was working in community college, so I needed something that would get their attention right out of the gate, and this does it. And there's lots of things you could sub in here depending on who you work with, but again, we can talk about that. For right now, I would love to go back to the Jamboard if we could, and I'm just looking in the chat. Love that. So let's go back to the Jamboard right now. And so now let's think again. If you were standing in front of your students, what now did you hear in this poem about Islamophobia? What have their experiences been that you could now add to this? So I'll give you a moment to do that. The link is right there in the chat. I don't know, Basma, you're having a hard time using the Jamboard. You can just put it in the chat.
You can always,
Because of some Google setting, you know, that you may or may not have. Okay, so exclusion and lack of recognition of religious holidays. Yep. Repeat the question. Yes. So the question is, now that you heard this poem, what would you add to the definition of Islamophobia? What have their experiences of Islamophobia been? What did they describe in here?
Not recognizing the humanity in others is another new one.
Mm-hmm.
Exclusion and terrorized by others based on looks and faith. I really love how the specificity of the definition is expanding from the first to the next. I'm really noticing that. Being judged for hijabs and beards is an example. That all other people see are the outside and judge that. The plot of a video game. Oh, that's a good one. Not recognizing that we are people and shouldn't be judged for who we are. These are great. Names like sand, N-word hurts Black people too. Being called, you know, these certain names are very, can overlap in terms of the injury that they cause.
Absolutely. And in the chat, I'm just also reading unreasonable dislike or fear of and prejudice against Muslims or Islam, racialization, surveillance, and street physical and verbal violence. Mhm.
Taking rights away based on fear. Thinking only one group's holiday means more than another.
Yeah, good stuff. Great. So, Habiba, is that exactly as you said, like with every activity in this lesson, and there are a number of other activities, you just keep coming back to this definition and it keeps getting more specific. And for me, that's everything because, I'm an artist. And so like, I'm a very visual person and, so much in teaching, and this is something I really had to learn through trial and error and just so many mistakes, like hitting students so hard over the head with like facts and figures about stuff instead of just slowing down a little bit and letting them like see it and define it for themselves. It's like by slowing it down, you give them the ability to have these little snapshots in their head that they can come back to. And that will help them. The point here is to build their critical thinking skills. It's not to sell them on anything. It's simply to have them, right? Like, what is it that I would want students to have? If somebody said, does Islamophobia exist? They're able to talk about evidence, and they're able to do it in a sophisticated way. I mean, I hope that that's one of the outcomes, that can be one of the outcomes of this lesson. So I'm going to stop for a second and just see if there's if anybody has any questions you want to drop in the chat about that intro. Again, this poem, has some fire and heat in it, which is great for some audiences. For some other audiences, it might not be appropriate. And so I think there's all sorts of other stuff you could sub in there.
They were frustrated for being judged by their looks, which is a really important aspect.
Mm-hmm. So let's see. What do we want to do? Okay, so any questions before we move on about that part? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I think we shall we transition to the oral history? Okay, so getting back to, now we're going to get back to the oral history. So we have this exercise where we're thinking about this term Islamophobia. People have heard it. People are they have some relationship with it. We listen to the poem to kind of expand our sort of definition of Islamophobia. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to listen to an oral history clip together. I will, let me go to that clip. So actually, let me start with this page 2 of the Jamboard, right? So we're going to listen to listen to a clip of the oral history by Rabia Yassine. She was born in 1991 in Midwood while studying political science in Brooklyn College. She was an undergrad. She joined the school's Islamic Society of Brooklyn College and the Muslim Women's Educational Initiative. That organization was targeted by New York City police, and she talks about that in her longer oral history. She became an activist against human rights abuses, and was also involved in Students for Justice in Palestine. And she focused her study on surveillance in New York City. But what so this is a little bit of a background. Many of the people in this oral history collection are leaders of different types, and she was a student leader. So what we're going to listen to is something that a lot of these narrators talk about, which is experience in their childhood. So what we're going to do is listen to this clip. It's 4 minutes and 50 seconds long. And as you're listening, I want you to think about what might be some moments of Islamophobia that you're hearing. And again, the question, we didn't ask her straight away, what was your experience of Islamophobia? She's just describing her childhood. and a memory of 9/11. So I will go ahead and start this.
So can you tell me what you remember of 9/11, of that day, how it unfolded for you?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to do this again because we will be able to follow the transcript. This is a nice thing.
So can you tell me
Let's see.
what you remember of 9/11, of that day, how it unfolded for you?
Sure. I'm laughing now because all these kids were leaving. So I remember I didn't know what had happened. I did know that one of my teachers, I don't remember who it was, but because in 5th grade we had like different teachers for different subjects. So my teacher had received a phone call that some crash happened in Manhattan. I had no idea what this crash entailed. Obviously, like all I thought was like, oh, this must be a car crash. Oh, how horrible, a car crash happened in Manhattan. But why did she have to receive a phone call for this? Like, I thought these things had happened normally. And throughout the day, we had students like leave, like their parents were calling them out, and just asking them to come home. And I remember thinking like, oh, mama would never call me home. She would never be like, Rabia, come home, for whatever reason. And actually, I didn't realize that those students were being called home because of the crash in Manhattan, whatever that crash may be. I hadn't connected the two. I just thought something other than that had happened, that students are being, called out. And I remember by the end of the day, I was just so upset. There was like maybe like 5 kids left in the class, me being one of them. And I was just so mad at my mom. Like, why didn't she pick me up? Like, why did she let me stay the whole day in school? Later on that day, we found out that, the planes had hit the towers and whatnot. But at the time, I didn't understand the implication of it. I thought, actually, it's so funny because I thought this was like a regular thing. Like, this happens all over the world. Now it's just happening here. I didn't understand really what this would entail. And then the following day, we understood, oh, hijackers. Hijacking became something that was a regular part of my language at that point, or after that, rather. And then Osama bin Laden, and, understanding that there is a negative connotations to like Muslims being in the news and Osama bin Laden. And I remember like a couple of months after that, I remember kids saying, oh, is Osama in your basement? Are you hiding him? Is he your uncle? And all of these different things that I'm sure that hundreds, if not thousands of like Muslim New Yorkers especially had to probably deal with.
How did you deal with it?
I became a bully. So in order to prevent me from being bullied, I became the bully. I was such a, especially like after 5th grade had ended. I remember in 5th grade, somebody had like pulled my scarf off. And I cried so much because I felt so violated. Not that I had any real like attachment to the scarf, like definitely not as like a religious thing or not even as like a cultural thing. It was just like, oh, I do this, whatever. But I felt like somebody had violated me because it was a part of me that they had ripped off. But the following year, especially this one kid, he would constantly would like the Osama bin Laden jokes. Like it was so lame. It was like you have like nothing else in your arsenal except this one lame thing that you keep saying. Meanwhile, I'm like literally on your entire life. Like how? But I became a really big bully like in middle school. And a lot of it was because of this fear that if I don't bully, someone's gonna bully me.
How did that manifest, your bullying?
I picked on anyone and everyone. I would say I was pretty witty, and so I could like, I don't know. I would just like make fun of people, make fun of the way that they looked, make fun of the way that they did things, or like especially like their level of intelligence. I always hit, like wherever I felt like somebody had an insecurity, I would like pick at that. So I was pretty good at finding out insecurities. And it's interesting because like years later when I met some of these people in college and just randomly, like totally coincidence, like if I would meet them coincidentally or whatever, I would apologize for being that person. And I remember this one person in college, I randomly saw him and I remember chasing him down and being like, do you remember me? And he's like, no, I don't. And I was just like, and I had to remind him. And in reminding him, I was crying so much. Like, I bullied you, man. Like, I'm so sorry about the person that I was then. And, explaining myself to him and that I'm different and that I've like repented. And he does not understand anything or did not understand anything that I was saying to him. But I remember crying so much, like, I'm sorry for being that way. And but I was a bully. I was really mean, but it was survival.
Okay. Take a second to kind of process that oral history. And let's just start with your reactions to what you heard. Let's just throw that in the chat. Like, what were some reactions before we get into defining anything? Just any reactions towards that clip from Rabia? The last sentence, it was survival. Yeah. And also, if anybody would like to unmute themselves and speak, you're welcome to do that as well. Relatable. I'm not even Muslim, and I just have an Arabic last name. I think that's interesting. And I think, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Elena, about the relatability of this.
Yes. So I grew up in Italy, and I know that probably in the US, it was even worse to live as a Muslim or a person of Arabic descent after 9/11. In Italy, it was pretty brutal too. And, it just hit me hard when the interviewee was saying about the jokes about Osama bin Laden, because it's something that I experienced too. And even in my teens, when I ran for school council, people were accusing me of being a fundamentalist Muslim. And I was like, I'm not even a Muslim. It's just that my dad is Lebanese. Like and I needed to justify myself. Well, now I'm like, I'm an adult, who cares? But when you're a teenager and that hits you, you just don't know how to justify yourself.
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing. Stella writes, it's heartbreaking how her life was changed and her social persona, right? Just this idea that these actions kind of did a certain type of work into her own, like a negative work in producing something that she then had to live with, right? That we hear that story, and it's really authentic as an oral history clip. Yasmin writes, talks about the idea of defending herself so she would not be seen as strong and weak. I think so there's something that I want to bring up here, and that is sort of the value of listening to oral histories in class. Those of you that teach literature have heard of this notion of like using literature as literature can be windows and mirrors, right? How many have heard of this concept of windows and mirrors? You can like show the thumbs up or whatever emoji. I mean, the thing about that's great about oral histories is that, like literature, oral history can do that same work, but it is a first person story, and it's very authentic because it's not because it's something that's where people are revealing their stories kind of in real time during this interview. And I think that, even though this young woman, people who are listening to this may or may not be Muslim, but they can listen to this through the lens of window and mirror, that they might see some aspect of themselves in it, or they might also be seeing some aspect of someone else. And in this case, for Elena, I think it's like you really heard the mirroring of your own experience, right? And I think some of you in this group might also have felt some things that were very relatable. But then there were also some things that were very specific to her story as a young Muslim woman wearing hijab right after 9/11. There's certain things that are very specific to that time period. So it's a window into that time period, a window into the perspective of a young woman who has a particular relationship to her hijab. So I hope that just from that listening experience that you can see kind of this level of authenticity. And it's suddenly, I personally feel that when I listen to these oral histories, it's as though this person has become my friend, right? And you suddenly have this relationship with this person. And And I think students can also have the opportunity, especially if they're listening with headphones, right? It's like you're listening to this individual person talking about their experiences. So we're going to go back to the Jamboard. And let me just do share screen. We're going to go back to the Jamboard. And I want us to revisit. Okay, now just Allison, should we go back to the big one? Or can we, or what do you say? Should we go to just for Rabia?
Yeah, it's probably easier to see if we just stay on this one, this slide.
On the Rabia slide?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the Rabia. So now we're kind of, again, continuing with this notion of defining Islamophobia. We hear first person narrative. Now you can either put this in the chat or on the Jamboard, ideally on the Jamboard, but if that's not possible, then that's okay. Let's think of what were some examples of Islamophobia that we heard. What was the Islamophobia that we heard? And how can we describe Islamophobia? Do we need to, can we share the link once again? If you go to the Jamboard, or if the Jamboard is too complicated, then you can just throw it into the chat and we can add it to the Jamboard also. Oh, transference of trauma. Ooh, like that, right? That's great.
In the chat, taking off her hijab, the constant jokes and assumptions.
Constant jokes and assumptions. Taking off the hijab, pulling off the hijab was an example of Islamophobia. Okay, if it's not working right now, you can either refresh it or just throw it into the chat. So another example of Islamophobia is taking off the hijab, constant jokes of assumptions. And I think that this language that was put in, thank you so much for whoever wrote transference of trauma, is to kind of think that it can transform a person, right? It has these sort of psychological, personal identity development kind of implications. So we have this definition of Islamophobia has the power, right? It's not just this thing that is a definition. We can add, like, I think connecting to this green sticky note, that it has power and that it has a force on individual lives. Warps minds, being able to direct vitriol it has that power of warping the mind and to be able to direct vitriol to a 5th grader. That's great. Thank you so much for that. Blaming Rabia for the 9/11 and asking if Osama bin Laden is hiding in her house. Islamophobia entered into her private space, right? So it kind of moves through borders. It moves through the walls of a home, right? Through the walls of a school. It circulates. And in that circulation, I'm just like riffing off of your comment, Basima. As it's circulating, it has different, it's doing different things in those different spaces. And so we're kind of getting at sort of the force and the power of Islamophobia. I think that's great. That's terrific. Okay, so that was Rabia. Oh, did somebody raise their hand? Basima, you want to add something?
I just want to add, it's very interesting what you just mentioned about circulates. Actually, Islamophobia didn't went actually inside the houses. It's in the borders,
yeah,
and the cafes, and the restaurants, in schools. It really permeates everywhere, and that's the thing about Islamophobia. Some people still resist to use the concept of the word Islamophobia, especially in the Netherlands I'm talking about. And they call it Muslim discrimination, anti-Muslim discrimination, or racism, something like this, because they find that the word Islamophobia is very loaded.
Yeah.
So that's also another level actually of, hiding it or giving an excuse or saying it doesn't exist and you're exaggerating. So going back to Rabia, I mean, I've seen this not only with my own children, but also with other children. And now with the refugees we have from Syria. And I mean, it's popping up again. It's up and running, I would say.
Yeah. And I think, I thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that what we're hearing in Rabia also is that where there is this force, there's also a resistance of this force, right? Like if we just think to sort of action reaction, it has this power, but it will also be resisted. And so Rabia is showing us her way of resisting this, but again, to get to the point that was made earlier, that this is survival, that resistance can also be a form of survival, that becoming the bully, which she, in the end, she felt quite bad about that, but it was a form of survival. And I just want to kind of put this to the side to say that everything that we're generating, we started with a sort of a primary definition of Islamophobia, but I think that already we're seeing how this has expanded. We're going to move to another oral history clip that we're going to listen to. I will tell you a little bit about this other individual, a narrator, Mohammad Razvi, who's based in Brooklyn. He was born in 1971 in Pakistan. His family immigrated to the United States in the late 70s, settled in Sheepshead Bay, started several businesses in Midwood. Those of you that know Brooklyn know that there are many South Asians, Pakistanis that live in this region. And he founded the Council of People organizations after 9/11. And he's worked with law enforcement agencies and has really been a very important community organizer. And I think that, the documenting his oral history is really important to kind of document what was happening in Brooklyn at the time. So I'm going to, we're going to go to his oral history, which again can be found in the website. If we go to Hear Stories, we can find Mohammad Razvi. Actually, we'll go to Meet the Narrators instead. We'll go to Meet the Narrators, find Mohammad Razvi, who is right down here. And we have a couple of clips from Mohammad Razvi because he bore witness to a real shift in his neighborhood right after 9/11. And as we're listening, I want us to kind of go back to just, keep a few things in mind. Well, first, you should just listen, right? And typically, I would say best practices for oral history, especially with students when we're listening, is to actually listen more than once, but we don't have the time for that. But if I were doing this in a class, I would just have the students kind of sit back and listen, and then I would have them listen again. Well, first round, sit back, listen, have your reactions. Second go around, listen and identify phrases that tie back to evidence of Islamophobia. And so, but like, as I said, we don't have time for that, but we're gonna listen. We may have to cut it short. I might cut this one short, but this is a longer clip. So you can just sit back and listen for these, I would say like 8 minutes. If I think that we'll probably just let me cut it short. How it goes, I'll find a good place to stop. And then we'll do a similar reflection where we're just kind of reacting, and then we're going to think about the Islamophobia that we hear. I will go to the interactive transcript, which is very useful, again, for students to follow along with the transcript. Okay.
All right, so during the time of special registration, this is what was happening. This was one of our clients. Any person who was Pakistani, they were in a catch-22 if they were a visitor into the United States. They were damned if they didn't register, and they were damned if they did. This particular student registered. He had a visa. He was going to school. When he registered, he was detained for almost, I think, 24 hours. He wasn't allowed to get anything to eat. And then he was informed that he has to leave the country. He's like, but my visa says I'm allowed to stay and I'm allowed to go to school here. But yet they were being put into deportation proceedings. And this is what happened to so many at that time. This is what scared the community. This is what scared everyone and anyone who was here. 25 countries were put onto that, and Pakistan was one of those countries.
Put on the list of countries people had to register.
Wow. If they were from there. Other things that happened in the community, and we'll show you, individuals who were trying to become citizens of the United States and who went through the process were being denied citizenship because they're saying that, you need to go through a background check. And the background, it takes you usually in the immigration process to naturalize close to 4 to 5 years. You have to be a green card holder. After becoming a green card holder, then you apply for becoming a citizen. So now what happened was individuals were putting to 2 or 3 years for background check, which means you can't become a citizen after 5 years. You're going to become a citizen maybe after 8 years. And people couldn't vote. People couldn't advance in their careers. They couldn't do anything. And we found out because Daily News aired the story that there were over 2.7 million names of applicants into the FBI for additional background checks, causing a backlog. We worked with our Congresswoman, Yvette Clarke, at that time, and she emphasized, and then all of a sudden, they started to move, and many applications were starting to be reviewed. Otherwise, it would never have happened.
The story came out in 2006.
Yep. Try to scan and get it to you. I can get you all this information. Okay. More than this, we also found out people who registered, who complied, were being put into deportation proceedings, and about 83,000 individuals registered with the FBI and INS under the special registration program. Not one individual was even alleged to have any types of link for terrorism. However, they put 13,000 individuals into deportation proceedings. And the reasons were being very, how could I say it? The reasons were very simple. 10 years ago, you had moved to Brooklyn, to Queens, and you didn't inform us. We're going to deport you. Those were the reasons being used at that time.
Practically cooked up.
Well, it's not cooked up. It's actually, it is a guideline in the book for immigration protocol, but, this was something that was never practiced, never emphasized. So, and then all of a sudden we're hearing that Guatemalans were being deported, Jamaicans were being deported, and I'm like, oh my God. And they were using the same rhetoric just to deport those individuals. Here's a story in the Village Voice where a person was being deported and he was in detention. His name is Tariq Zafar. He was about to have a wedding and he went to visit his family and come back, and they started putting into deportation proceedings. I intervened and helped and assisted them. And, lo and behold, it took some time, but then they finally released him. And till today, he comes and visits me and tells me, now I have kids and I'm living my American dream. Thank you so much. Those are the things that I live for.
Did he make it to his wedding?
He made it to his wedding. That was the thing. That's why I emphasized, like, oh my God, how could you? This is not. Here's another case. This is the Shahid Ali Khan's case. This person, the father, who also registered, he was apprehended, put into deportation proceedings. His child, who's quadriplegic and also has to get a feeding tube in his stomach, was put into deportation proceedings. This aired. I aired it. I contacted the USCIS, and they looked at the case, and thank God, then they released him May 11th, 2005. he was able to reunite with his family. And his case was the one that just recently came up that was aired in the New Yorker magazine.
And you told me before the recording how it all came out.
Yes, and I was so happy. He came to me, 2 days ago. He goes, Mo, I got this. Mr. Razvi, look, I got this. They're letting me stay. And I was so happy. No, the order of stay is in effect, and they're not just, they're not going to put him into deportation proceedings at the moment.
Great.
Okay, I'm just gonna pause right there for the, just for the interest of time. So like we did in the last session, I want you to kind of in the chat, can we just throw in some reactions to what you heard? Points that stood out from your
What is
points
the
that stood out.
background? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Habiba. I think somebody is not muted.
Okay.
Renato, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's get some reactions to the to Mohammed Razvi's clip. What did we hear? And I will upload this as well. Anything that we heard that we want to share? I want to also add, actually, let me add that I think that with students, it would be useful to learn a little bit about what was special registration, or maybe some of them might say, well, what is this registration? I just want to point you to some additional resources that we have in the Muslims in Brooklyn website with some excellent short readings, which are good for teachers and or for high school students. In this particular PDF, we have a reading written by Donna Austin, who that kind of describes some of the registration policies, special registration policies that were enacted right after 9/11. So that's some additional resources that are particularly useful. So what did we hear?
Hi, this is Wanda. I was teaching the kids about Pearl Harbor and the Asian Exclusion Act and how they put them into the internment camps. And I'm sure if they could have, they probably would have done that with Muslim people, but they couldn't do that. It was not so evident, like wasn't so easy to see their faces to put them in these camps and deport them, because if they could have, they would deport the Japanese people too. And I was explaining that to the kids because I teach middle schoolers, like this is my 7th and 8th graders. A lot of the German and Italians, there are very few of them that were put in those camps, but it was about what they could see and who they could pull and who has less power. So those are the people that usually end up in these situations. And the bias and the fear and all the rhetoric that they build up against, oh, these people are going to do something to us. They're not American. I got from this too.
Yeah, for sure. Again, like thinking about maybe even like applying that window and mirror lens to history, right? Thinking if this is this mirrors this sort of other aspects of history.
Yeah, I love that. I'm just going to jump in also and say, I don't have it handy, but I vividly remember like the months and years after 9/11, the number of political pundits that did suggest that we start rounding up Muslims and put them in camps. It wasn't like fringe idea. And that would be a great resource to show students too. I mean, that level of reaction.
Yeah. So if we think about sort of how does this expand our notion of Islamophobia, I'm seeing some things that are really important here. Institutional racism and discrimination, excuses to, justify actions towards people deemed as others. It's another instance of Islamophobia where immigration laws are weaponized. Okay, so we're thinking about the law. In the last oral history, we were thinking about sort of the personal impact, but here we're thinking about the law, right? Islamophobia is present in immigration laws. there's a lack of compassion, right? That the law actually, the law is not compassionate. The law is the law, and people feel like they are just doing their job by fulfilling these mandates for registration. And the lack of compassion was really apparent in these different people's stories. So, okay, we have, I think we're going to move on, but I think that this term is really important. This term is really important: institutional racism and discrimination. We're thinking about how the Islamophobia is embedded into the system. And let's get some, I've seen some comments. This would be an excellent way to put people in a position of empathy through observed experience, right? I mean, there's something very particular and unique to the learning that happens from listening to a story, right? That again, it's as though this person is sitting with you and explaining something that they witnessed, that versus, a reading about what happened in Coney Island Avenue. I think that one should do those readings, but I think that sometimes when you're starting with this personal connection, then the reading suddenly becomes more significant. The research can then have a whole nother feel and meaning. So this, in many ways, this could be kind of pre-reading. It can kind of build literacy in those particular ways. And like I said, we have some readings that are available on the website, and they can, of course, do their own research, right? They might have a research question. What was this special registration? It was a very particular moment in time. It is no longer in effect, but they might have these very authentic questions from listening to these lived experiences. Shall we shift over to our last topic? Let me go. Do we want to talk about the institutional?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I love those oral histories, and I would say that would be an amazing way to start, this What is Islamophobia lesson. As somebody mentioned in the comments, like first just to build empathy, and having that empathy as a way to kind of open up and then explore more deeply, like what happened and what are people talking about when they talk about anti-Muslim bias, and then using this lesson. So the lesson plan, you saw the introductory activity. Basically, after that, students break down into small groups, and they're each given a folder. And in each of the folder, there's all kinds of information about Islamophobia. And they basically go through that as a group. They talk about it. What is this? What happened? Then they go around and teach each other. The directions are very clear. Everything. So much of what I learned in curriculum writing, I learned because I love reading cookbooks. So the lesson is good at like step-by-step instructions. If you follow the instructions, it's really clear. But I want to get to the end, the final activity, because it ties into what Habiba was just talking about, which is the final activity is introducing the concept of interpersonal versus structural discrimination. And this is so important to talk about any kind of discrimination, because in the United States, overwhelmingly racism is represented as a pathology, as an individual pathology. Some crazy was like drinking beer, watching Fox News, and then went out and like snapped off on someone. And that's not helpful at all to transform society, because the way we transform society is through transforming the structures that allow discrimination to continue to fester. And so the lesson, this part of the lesson is so important. It's just going back and looking at all the examples that you used in the lesson, and then having students talk about, is this interpersonal? Is it structural? Are there aspects of it that maybe are both? And just giving them the vocabulary to be able to talk about that, and to be able to do that kind of differentiation, And I think, of course, you can use these oral histories to do then the same thing. You could go back and like layer on some of these oral histories and say, okay, listen to these stories. What are they talking about? Habiba, you want to add anything to that?
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, yeah. I just kind of threw up this kind of graphic organizer that, we have these two different examples. I think in Rabia, we really hear some interpersonal forms of racism, Islamophobia. And then we have some other examples that to have students do a Venn diagram of sorts to kind of reflect on these two might be another way to kind of move these ideas. How about we throw some examples up on this? What do we think?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So what examples do people know of interpersonal versus structural forms of Islamophobia?
Even just from these two oral histories, but or some, and they might go beyond these oral histories as well.
Yeah, and feel free to put it in the chat if that's easier. We can read them.
Immigration law, for sure.
Yep, interpersonal bullying, violation of personal space.
Yeah. The technicalities of the law, right? Tokenism in societies that largely excludes religious minority and customs, like, perhaps not considering religious holiday for a test is structural. It might not be interpersonal. A person, even though of course these are made by people, but these become baked into the system and into the law.
Structural bias laws and use of the law trumps Muslim bans. Yep.
Yeah, structural is the Muslim ban for sure. Legal dehumanization from on high that led to the permission to dehumanize Rabia in school. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. Like the absence of training of teachers and of school leaders on how to deal with these issues. That's a really, that becomes structural, right? And in that case, the structural can enable the interpersonal. And so that's what I like about that comment, is that there's this relationship between the structural and the interpersonal.
Someone else in the chat put not recognizing religious holidays as structural. Structural use elections programs to polarize Muslims and immigrants.
Yeah. I mean, I think, something that would be interesting to talk about with students would be, we have things that are really much about people's interpersonal relationships, and then we have these structures, but the shared experience of them is, what do they both do? What is the work? What do they both do? Yeah, it can become a very theoretical conversation, but I think the important thing here is to be able to have vocabulary to identify what's going on.
Yeah, I would just add to that too, there's a lesson, a more advanced lesson in the Challenge Islamophobia project called Who Benefits? And I think that is a lesson that, is a great extension of this, right? So even once you do the interpersonal structural differentiation, like who cares? Like who cares if students have that language, right? And so for me, taking that step further is for students to begin to understand that certain people and institutions benefit from discrimination. Again, when we pathologize racism, it becomes unfixable because it's because of some, forces that we can't control, or people that we can't control. And we want to give students an experience of understanding that, no, these are very intentional, choices that are made, and lots of people benefit. And so how do we take the benefits away from discrimination? One example I would give for that, and that people didn't include in the structural piece is, remember the US launched the longest war in US history after 9/11. that we're still dealing with the consequences of, and the amount of money that was spent, on this. There are so many different ways to see how some people benefit enormously. The war on terror, that's right. And remembering that during the war on terror, weapons manufacturers in the US made record profits, right? Because you don't make profits unless you drop bombs. And so lots of people, again, benefit from this kind of demonization of communities that then makes it possible for the government to transfer money, to victimize people.
I think we have like a few more minutes where we can take some questions or comments about the lesson, about kind of, I'm curious to hear what is your, in what way could you potentially bring this lesson into your class or the oral histories? Do any of you already address Islamophobia in your classes, or do you even address this distinction between the interpersonal and the structure? I'm really curious to hear some feedback from you all. I'm actually sitting here in Texas. You're teaching the reluctant fundamentalist. Oh, wow. Okay, what grade, Tasneem? Oh, terrific. And you're in Brooklyn, Tasneem, I'm presuming, teaching the reluctant fundamentalist. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. And I think this is terrific. Like, I think the goals with culturally relevant pedagogy is to be able to see diversity of folks in the material, right? So you're focusing on rhetoric. You're not teaching the reluctant fundamentalists to teach about Islam necessarily, but it's just another text kind of the diverse landscape. And I think that was actually one of the goals of the Muslims in Brooklyn project, is to kind of diversify the voices, that we hear in the classroom. Basima, someone?
I would like to add one example. In the Netherlands, we have a very famous politician. His name is Geert Wilders.
Yes.
And in 2014, he had a kind of rhetoric. He said, minder Marokkanen means less Moroccans. So 6,000 people, actually, they went to the police station and they filed a case against him. That was you could see for the first time in the history of the Netherlands, people standing in, long lines. And he didn't expect that, of course. And the whole case actually took us in the Netherlands, from one court to the other for 6 years. And then the end, they said, well, because he's a politician and, they said it's not supposed to be said. But at the end, for me, it's the damage. It's not about that it took 6 years. It's not about that he said it. It's the impact on the generations. I'm talking about the children at that age. Now they are, becoming adults. They are still talking about it. So for me, sometimes, it's not only about the rhetoric. It's about, the mental also damage that can have, a certain, the children and their parents. So it's one of the things. I don't know about in the US, you're aware, because he went also actually to the USA before the election campaigns of Trump, and he was, talking about, that he's proud to say this in the Netherlands, and if he can say it in the Netherlands, why you shouldn't say it also in the US. So there, Le Pen also in France, and with this new one also coming up, Zemmour. So it's fascism started in Europe, and it will always stay in Europe. And they are exporting as if they are, exchanging those rhetoric and, their experiences. And that's worrying, for the coming years. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And I think that, I'm thinking back to the, to a definition that someone put on back to the definition of Islamophobia, is to kind of pay attention to the transference of trauma right? That's a very real aspect, and that there's, again, as we're developing our definition and thinking about this, it is something that has power, it has effect, it has personal psychological ramifications. And I think, both the interpersonal and the structural can do that, right? That trauma is, and it has consequences. It's not just going to sit there. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, I just want to add that, these oral histories, they are not all focused on Islamophobia. There are some, actually, the Islamophobia is not a center of these oral histories. The oral histories really is about the diverse experiences of the diverse population of Muslims in Brooklyn. And there's humor, there's trauma, there's memory, there's sharing stories from different eras of people's lives that are here. It's not all, I think that these can be very useful in just sort of diversifying and filling the gaps that are out there in terms of people's stories in New York.
I have to admit, Habiba, one of my favorite stories actually comes from Linda Sassour, because I was able to directly understand, and I felt like she was talking about me because I grew up here in Brooklyn. She was talking about how when she was a little girl, and if she did something on one end of the block, by the time she got home, her mother knew it. Matter of fact, the entire neighborhood knew it. And I was like, yep, everybody's an auntie. That's exactly what I felt too. Yeah. So I completely understand. But I'd like to say thank you, Habiba and Allison. This was wonderful. I really got a lot out of this, and thank you so much. Thank you both for participating, and thank you both for taking the time to answer questions and come up with this wonderful presentation. We are so appreciative of you taking your time to join us for the second in our Muslim in Brooklyn series of workshops. If you enjoyed today's workshop, we hope you'll consider joining us for future education workshops with the Center for Brooklyn's History. Our next and last workshop will be on January 12th, and it'll be a conversation with Council Member-elect Shahana Hani as she discusses growing up Muslim in Brooklyn. If you'd like, and if you happen to have students who are interested in a great way to support a project-based learning and research in your classrooms, especially if you are remote learning, even if you're not, consider having your students participate in this year's New York City History Day, which is for middle and high school students. The Center for Brooklyn History is the proud host of this year's virtual contest, and we're partnering with cultural institutions around the city and state to support New York City students and educators who are interested in participating in the nation's biggest history competition. This year, the New York City contest is free and open to all students grades 6 through 12, and registration will open officially January 24th. However, pre-registrations just for teachers will open January 9th to the 23rd. Finally, I'd like to conclude with an urgent request to fill out a short survey about your experience attending today's event. As we navigate this virtual world, I can sincerely say your feedback will directly impact the way we offer future professional learning workshops. This survey is also your key to CTLE credit. Those seeking credit will receive an option at the end of the survey to enter their details for this purpose. Only those that fill out the survey will receive credit. I repeat, only those that fill out the survey will receive credit. Those that request should keep their eyes peeled for a digital confirmation of your CTL credit within the next week. On behalf of Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History, I would like to thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good night.
I couldn't access the link for the survey.
We just put it back up. If you click on it again and see if it'll work.
Look, it's in the chat. Is it in
Yes,
the
it's
chat?
in the chat. It's in the chat. Yes.
Oh, no. I can't access that. So let's see it.
We just put another link to the survey, a direct link.
Still no. Let me go back. It's at the top.
No, in the chat, if you go to the last, all the way at the end in the chat, you should see the links.
Okay. Okay, I saw it now. Thanks.
Thank you.